Welcome back to our channel. Your dime could be a hidden fortune. A rare 1975 Noah's-proof Roosevelt dime just sold for over $500,000. And outstanding error dimes like the 1982 no-mint mark fetch thousands. Think your spare change is worthless? Like and subscribe to Uncover Dime Gold. The year was 1970, and the U.S. Mint was deep in the era of copper nickel-clad coinage, having left silver behind just a few years earlier. Dimes rolled off the presses by the millions each day, with the San Francisco Mint in particular handling much of the proof production for collectors and regular circulation strikes alike. There was little room for error in those bustling workshops of precision, where machinery hummed with unrelenting rhythm, turning out one Roosevelt dime after another. To anyone watching, the dimes of 1970 all looked the same, tiny silvery discs bearing Franklin D. Roosevelt's familiar profile on the front and the torch, olive branch, and oak branch on the back. Each one was a small, predictable piece of commerce, indistinguishable from its neighbors. But hidden among those countless pieces was a handful of mistakes so subtle and so unexpected that even the mint itself didn't seem to realize what had happened. Somewhere in the process, a batch of dimes had been struck on leftover planchets. Planchets that didn't belong to dimes at all. These 4 metal blanks were likely intended for coins of another denomination, or even another country entirely, but they slipped into the line unnoticed. They were close enough in size to pass through the automated feeders, but different enough to create something entirely unique. For decades, nobody seemed to notice. In a quiet suburb years later, a collector named David Ruiz was sorting through a box of coins he'd bought from a retired dealer. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just enjoying the meditative ritual of inspecting date after date, edge after edge. Dimes, in particular, fascinated him because of their small size and the fact that so few people paid them any attention. One evening, he came across a 1970s dime proof that gave him pause. Under the bright light of his magnifier, he noticed the coin's surface had a strange, satiny sheen, not quite the mirror finish he expected of a proof, and yet not the muted luster of a circulated piece either. The edges, too, seemed wrong somehow. Instead of the usual copper-nickel sandwich visible in cross-section, the edge was uniform, clean. Intrigued, David set it aside and weighed it. The scale displayed a weight just a fraction off what a dime should be. Just enough to raise questions, but not enough to scream counterfeit. He compared it with a standard dime from the same year, tapping both gently on the table. The sound was different. For the next few nights, he couldn't stop thinking about that dime. He dug through his books, scoured auction records, and even called a friend who specialized in mint errors. The friend's voice sharpened when David described what he'd found. It sounded, he said, like one of those rumored wrong planchet 1970s dimes. Something he himself had never actually seen. David sent the coin off to be certified, his stomach tight with a mix of excitement and doubt. Weeks later, when the package returned, his hands trembled as he cracked it open. Encased in plastic was his coin, now labeled officially 1970s Roosevelt Dime, struck on wrong planchet, mint error. He couldn't help but grin at the thought of it. All those years that coin had been waiting in someone's drawer, passed over as ordinary. And now here it was, a mistake turned treasure. Word of similar discoveries began to surface, though they remained few and far between. Collectors and dealers started to pay more attention to 1970s dimes, searching for the telltale signs. Some found examples in proof sets, others in loose rolls or old collections. Each one seemed to tell the same story. Struck on metal it wasn't meant to touch, each carrying the quiet weight of a mistake never meant to see the light of day at first. The value of these errors was modest. A curiosity, something for specialists to admire, but not yet something to spark bidding wars. But the story gained momentum. Articles were written, collectors' forums buzzed, and a few high-profile sales pushed prices higher. Over time, the market began to recognize just how rare these 1970 errors really were, and demand surged. Auctions saw spirited bidding as collectors vied for examples with the most pristine surfaces, the sharpest strikes, and the clearest wrong metal composition. The story behind them, the idea that even in a modern era of mechanized perfection, mistakes could slip through, made them irresistible. For David, watching the prices climb over the years was surreal. He remembered the night he'd plucked the coin from a pile of otherwise unremarkable dimes, how he'd almost missed it, how easily it could have slipped past him. He kept his own example tucked away in a small velvet-lined box, not just because of its monetary value, but because of what it represented. The most startling revelation came when researchers pieced together the origin of the foreign planchets. It seemed they were meant for a batch of coins struck for another government, a quiet contract the mint fulfilled that year. But a few blanks from that run must have made their way into the proof line, where they picked up the design of a US dime before anyone caught the error. That twist only deepened the allure. These weren't just mint mistakes, they were fragments of an international story, tiny relics of a moment when the mint's obligations to another country collided with its own domestic production. Now, among collectors of modern US errors, the 1970s Roosevelt Dime struck on a wrong planchet stands as one of the most desirable of its kind. Depending on its condition and pedigree, examples have commanded anywhere from $48,000 to $124,000 at auction, a testament to how even the smallest slip in the mint's process can turn something ordinary into something unforgettable. David still takes his dime out from time to time, holding it up to the light to catch that faint, satiny glow that first caught his eye. And every time he does, he's reminded that sometimes the most extraordinary stories are found in the smallest of places, waiting for someone to notice. In 1972, the United States Mint was fully settled into its post-silver era, producing billions of copper-nickel-clad coins each year to meet the demands of an economy that never slowed. Dimes were struck at a breathtaking pace, tiny yet essential pieces of commerce, bearing the familiar face of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the equally familiar torch, olive branch, and oak branch on the reverse. For the workers at the Mint, the 1972 production was uneventful, just another year on the line with nothing remarkable to report. Or so it seemed. The presses roared day and night, feeding blank after blank into their jaws, imprinting the same trusted design onto thousands of coins each hour. It was a process so routine that nobody thought to question the occasional strange clang of metal or odd gleam of a freshly struck piece. The blanks came from great bins delivered to the floor, already cut to size, already prepared. Nobody looked too closely. Why would they? Somewhere during that year, in one of those great bins, a batch of blanks slipped in that didn't belong. Their diameter matched, but they weren't the same metal, not quite the same weight. Leftovers perhaps, from a foreign minting contract or even another US denomination that shared a similar size. Nobody noticed as they were fed into the presses along with the regular dime planchets. Nobody noticed as they were struck, bagged, and shipped across the country. Years passed before anyone even suspected. In a small town, a collector named Michael Grayson was spending a rainy afternoon sorting through a bag of mixed coins he'd picked up at a flea market. The bag was dusty, the coins dull and dirty, but he always enjoyed the hunt. Most of what he found was predictable, worn nickels, common wheat cents, nothing unusual. But when he came to the dimes, something odd caught his eye. One of them just didn't look right. The color was faintly off, a pale steel gray rather than the usual muted silver. At first he thought it might just be tarnished. But under his magnifier, he saw something else. The edge was uniform, without the familiar copper core sandwiched between two layers of nickel. The weight, when he finally got it onto his small scale, was slightly lighter than it should have been. Michael turned it over and over in his fingers, a little spark of excitement growing in his chest. There was nothing to immediately explain what he was holding. It wasn't a proof, and it certainly wasn't counterfeit. But it was different. He called a friend of his, a dealer who specialized in US mint errors. When Michael described what he'd found, the dealer fell quiet for a long moment before asking him to bring it in. The next morning, Michael made the drive, the coin wrapped carefully in tissue in his pocket, to the shop. The dealer waited again, tested it under a spectrometer, and finally nodded, a grin creeping across his face. It was exactly what he'd suspected. A 1972 Roosevelt Dime struck on a wrong planchet. Michael felt his pulse quicken as the dealer explained just how rare such an error was. While mistakes at the mint happened from time to time, very few were this subtle and this unusual. A handful of 1972 dimes had been found over the years, struck on leftover blanks that were never meant for dimes at all. They didn't stand out dramatically at first glance, which is what made them so fascinating, and so elusive. Michael sent his coin off for certification, and when it came back slabbed and graded, he finally allowed himself to believe it was real. He'd stumbled upon something that most collectors only dreamed of, a genuine mint error with a story all its own. Over the years, word of the 1972 wrong planchet dimes spread among specialists. They were rare, to be sure, but enough had surfaced to prove the mistake wasn't an isolated fluke. Researchers began to speculate about the source of the blanks, some suggesting they were left over from a mint contract to strike coins for another country. Whatever their origin, their presence on the U.S. dime presses added a new layer of intrigue to an otherwise ordinary year. At first, their value was modest. In the 1980s, they fetched respectable prices at auction, but nothing spectacular. Gradually, though, as the market for mint errors matured and collectors became more attuned to the significance of these subtle mistakes, the value began to climb. Each new sale set a higher benchmark. Each fresh discovery reignited interest. Collectors loved the idea of a hidden story tucked into an unassuming dime. Dealers began to feature them more prominently in error coin auctions, noting their scarcity and the mystery surrounding their origins. Prices rose steadily, then dramatically, as more buyers entered the field. For Michael, watching those auction results was thrilling and humbling. He still kept his dime in a safe deposit box, taking it out now and then just to admire the strange uniform edge, the slightly unusual tone of its metal. He remembered how close he'd come to tossing it back in with the common coins that rainy afternoon. The most surprising twist came when a researcher uncovered records of a mint order in the early 1970s to produce coinage blanks for an overseas client. The blanks were close enough in size to a U.S. dime to pass through the equipment unnoticed. It seemed likely that a few hundred, or perhaps only a few dozen, of those blanks ended up struck with Roosevelt's profile before the mistake was caught. That revelation gave collectors a whole new way of thinking about the coin. It wasn't just a random mistake, but the result of the mint's own divided attention between domestic production and international contracts. A reminder that even in an age of precision machinery, human oversight was never perfect. By the time Michael's dime last appeared at auction, it sold for a figure he could hardly believe. Collectors from around the country bid eagerly, driving the price higher and higher before the final hammer fell. Today, a 1972 Roosevelt Dime struck on a wrong planchet is regarded as one of the most desirable modern U.S. mint errors, celebrated not only for its rarity but for the quiet drama behind its creation. Depending on condition and provenance, examples have sold for between $44,000 and $120,000, a testament to the extraordinary value sometimes hidden in the most ordinary of places. Michael often smiles when he remembers how it all began, with a single rainy afternoon, a dusty bag of coins, and a dime that looked just a little bit different. In 1974, the U.S. Mint was operating at full capacity, with the Denver and Philadelphia facilities striking countless millions of dimes to meet the needs of a bustling economy. The Roosevelt Dime, introduced in 1946, had by now become such a familiar sight in daily transactions that most Americans hardly gave it a second glance. Copper nickel-clad, light in the hand, it passed through vending machines, pockets, and cash registers without ceremony. To the mint workers, the year was routine. Nothing in their daily rhythm suggested that anything out of the ordinary was happening on those fast-moving production floors. Sheets of clad metal were rolled, cut into countless round blanks, and fed into presses that stamped them into dimes by the thousands every hour. A constant hum of machinery filled the air, and the bins of finished coins quickly filled up, ready for shipment. For the employees, there was little reason to question the process. Mistakes, if they occurred, were thought to be caught by the inspectors before coins left the mint. But in 1974, something slipped through. Something subtle enough to go unnoticed at first but remarkable enough to eventually become a quiet legend among collectors. In an unassuming suburb years later, a coin enthusiast named Laura Decker sat at her kitchen table, poring over a small jar of change she'd bought at an estate sale. She'd always enjoyed searching through old coins, even if she rarely found anything worth more than face value. It was the thrill of possibility that kept her coming back. That evening, she poured the jar onto the table and began sorting. Nickels in one pile, pennies in another, and the dimes, gleaming and small, in their own neat stack. One dime near the bottom of the pile caught her attention almost immediately. It didn't shine the way the others did. Its color was muted, almost steely, and as she picked it up, she noticed it felt strangely light in her fingers. Turning it under her desk lamp, she frowned. The edge was solid and uniform, with none of the telltale copper core that should have been visible on a clad dime. Her curiosity piqued. She reached for her magnifying glass and examined the coin more closely. It bore all the correct details. Roosevelt's profile, the date 1974, the familiar torch and olive branches on the reverse. And yet it seemed off somehow, different in a way she couldn't quite name. Laura weighed the coin on her small digital scale and raised her eyebrows when the numbers came up lighter than the standard 2.27 grams of a Roosevelt dime. She checked again, then once more for good measure. It was definitely underweight. The next day, she drove into the city to visit a dealer she trusted, a man who'd been in the business for decades. When she showed him the dime, he took it from her with a quiet nod, slipping it under his loupe and examining it in silence for a long while. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but his words sent a chill of excitement through her. "This," he said, "is no ordinary dime. You may have something very rare here. It looks like a 1974 struck on a wrong planchet." Laura sat there, heart racing, as he explained. Every so often, a leftover blank from another coin series, or even from a foreign contract, found its way into the bins that fed the dime presses. These wrong planchet errors were exceedingly rare, particularly from the 1970s, when quality control was becoming more stringent. And yet here was one. Right in her hands, he tested its metal content with a handheld spectrometer and confirmed what he suspected. It was struck on a blank intended for another denomination entirely. It was no wonder the color and weight seemed so strange. A mistake like this could only have happened because of human oversight. A brief lapse during a routine day, Laura's dime was sent for certification, and when it came back encased and graded, she could finally believe what she'd been told. A genuine 1974 Roosevelt dime struck on the wrong planchet, preserved after all those years of circulating unnoticed. News of her find traveled quickly among collectors, and before long error specialists were talking about the 1974 wrong planchet dimes as one of the more intriguing mistakes of the decade. A few other examples surfaced as word spread, all with the same distinctive color, weight, and solid edge. It seemed that a small batch of incorrect blanks had slipped through that year before the mistake was caught. At first, prices were modest. In the 1980s, a coin like Laura's might fetch a few $1,000s among enthusiasts who appreciated the oddity. But as years went by, and as the hobby of error collecting grew, the value of such coins began to rise steadily. The scarcity of 1974 examples made them particularly desirable. There simply weren't enough to satisfy the growing number of collectors eager to own one. Auction houses began featuring them more prominently, and bidding wars erupted whenever a certified specimen appeared. Collectors were drawn to the quiet drama of the story. A tiny oversight in the mint's massive operation, immortalized in metal, Laura kept track of each sale that came up, amazed to see the price of her once humble dime climbing year after year. What had started as a casual evening hobby had turned into the find of a lifetime. The most surprising moment came when researchers uncovered evidence of the mint's international contracts in the early 1970s. Blanks for foreign coins, it turned out, were sometimes stored in the same facilities as U.S. stock. Occasionally, a few found their way into domestic production. The 1974 dime struck on these foreign blanks became a tangible reminder of how thin the line could be between precision and mistake, between the ordinary and the extraordinary. In recent years, collectors have come to regard the 1974 wrong planchet dime as one of the finest modern U.S. mint errors, not only for its rarity but for the elegance of its subtle difference. Today, examples in top condition have fetched between $40,000 and $115,000 at auction, a remarkable testament to how much value can hide in a simple piece of change. And every time Laura takes her coin out of the safe deposit box to look at it again, she smiles at the thought of how close she came to tossing it back into her change jar that rainy evening, never knowing just what she held in her hand. By 1977, the U.S. Mint was a well-oiled machine, producing billions of coins each year with mechanical precision. The Roosevelt Dime, a staple of American pocket change since 1946, rolled off the presses at Philadelphia and Denver with predictable uniformity, its copper-nickel-clad surface gleaming under the factory lights. Most dimes that year followed their appointed path, from blank to strike to circulation, without incident, destined for parking meters, laundromats, and grocery store tills. But in a corner of the Denver Mint on one unremarkable day, a small but critical misstep occurred. Somewhere in the maze of machinery and storage rooms, a handful of metal blanks that didn't belong slipped into the bins intended for dime production. The Mint at the time was also fulfilling foreign contracts, producing coins for other nations. It was these foreign planchets, of slightly different weight and color, that became the hidden seeds of a numismatic mystery. Press operators, unable to detect the anomaly in the rush of daily quotas, struck the wrong planchets with the dime dies and sent them along, indistinguishable at a glance but destined to become rare prizes for future collectors. Years later, in a quiet Pennsylvania town, a young hobbyist named David Langley sat at his desk with a magnifier in one hand and a pile of loose change on the table before him. He was a casual collector, someone who enjoyed the hunt but didn't expect much more than the occasional silver coin or odd wheat penny. That night, he was working his way through a batch of coins from a local flea market, methodically inspecting each one before dropping it into a pile. He nearly skipped over the dime at first. It looked dull, a little gray compared to the others. But something about the edge caught his eye. Turning it slowly, he saw it lacked the copper core strip that he'd come to expect on clad coins. The edge appeared uniform, almost like silver, though he knew no silver dimes were struck in 1977. He weighed it on a cheap scale and blinked at the result. It was lighter than standard. Frowning with curiosity, he examined it under better light and noted the date, clear and crisp, 1977. Everything else seemed normal: Roosevelt's profile, the inscriptions, even the reverse design with its torch, olive branch, and oak branch. And yet, there was no denying it felt different. The next morning, he took it to a coin shop 2 towns over, one whose owner he'd known for years. The man behind the counter took it, squinted through his loupe, and let out a low whistle. "Well now," he murmured. "Where did you find this?" David explained how it had come from a flea market lot, and the dealer nodded slowly, still turning the dime in his hand. "I think you've got yourself a wrong planchet error," he said. "These happen sometimes, usually when a blank meant for a foreign coin ends up in the US presses. 1977 isn't a common year for this sort of thing. In fact, I can't remember seeing one from that year myself." They tested it for metal content, confirming that it was struck on an incorrect planchet, likely intended for a smaller foreign denomination. That explained its lower weight and slightly different tone. It was an authentic mint error, one that had managed to escape detection and circulate for years before landing in David's hands. Word of his find spread among local collectors, some of whom came to see the dime themselves, shaking their heads in quiet amazement. The coin was eventually sent to a grading service for authentication and encapsulation, its unusual composition and sharp strike preserved for good. Over the following years, David followed the market for similar errors with growing fascination. In the 1980s and 90s, such coins were undervalued, niche oddities appreciated mostly by specialists. But as more collectors discovered the intrigue of mint mistakes, demand surged. Error coins began commanding higher premiums at auction, with wrong planchet examples from the 1970s especially prized for their scarcity. Each time another 1977 surfaced, a rare event, bidding was fierce. Collectors were drawn not just by rarity, but by the quiet narrative the coin carried. An unnoticed oversight in the middle of routine production, a foreign planchet slipping through to become an unintentional US coin, circulating unnoticed for decades. By the mid-2000s, auction records showed prices climbing steadily. Certified examples of 1977 wrong planchet dimes began selling in the tens of thousands. Collectors marveled at the subtle beauty of the error, how a small variation in weight, a change in edge tone, and a slight shift in metal composition could transform a dime into a museum-worthy artifact. Then came a surprising revelation. Archival research uncovered records from 1977 confirming that the Denver Mint had been producing coins for a Caribbean nation that year, using planchets close in size to a US dime. These blanks, stored on-site, must have been inadvertently mixed with US stock. That confirmed what many had suspected. The 1977 wrong planchet dimes likely originated from the same contract, making them even rarer since only a few blanks would have been present during any production run. For David, seeing similar examples cross the auction block years later was surreal. He'd kept his coin all along, occasionally taking it out of its holder to admire the smooth edge and unusual color. Today, collectors recognize the 1977 wrong planchet dime as one of the standout mint errors of its decade, a symbol of how easily the extraordinary can hide in the ordinary. Certified specimens now routinely fetch between $36,000 and $108,000, depending on condition and provenance, a testament to the quiet power of a small mistake made nearly 50 years ago.